It was early March, and I decided to take my camper out for a midweek trip. The woods right outside my house had plenty of dirt paths wide enough for my truck with the camper attached, so I often found myself spending a couple of nights there every month. My favorite spot was down a narrow trail leading to a secluded area by a large, serene lake. The lake stretched out for miles, but this particular spot was tucked away, so random and out of the way that I rarely encountered anyone else. That morning, I arrived and detached the camper from my truck. With my bag packed for a hike, I set off along the lake's edge. There weren't any official trails in the area, but walking along the shoreline gave me confidence that I wouldn't get lost. The peaceful solitude of the woods was one of the reasons I loved coming here. Only a few minutes into my hike, I stumbled upon something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A trailer. It was wedged between two large trees, rugged and weathered as if it had been abandoned for years. Yet I had been to this spot before, and I knew for a fact it wasn't there the last time. Someone had moved it here recently, but why? I stayed at a distance, my curiosity battling with a gnawing sense of unease. The trailer looked deliberately hidden, almost like whoever had placed it here didn't want it to be found. From what I could see, there were no signs of recent activity. No tracks, no smoke, nothing to suggest anyone had been staying there. But why would someone go to the trouble of dragging an old, beat-up trailer into such a remote location? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. Against my better judgment, I decided to approach. I knocked on the door, my knuckles echoing against the hollow metal. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time, and waited, straining my ears for any sound. Nothing. The silence was oppressive. My gut told me to leave, so I did. I turned and walked back to my camper, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling clinging to me. For the rest of the day, the trailer lingered in my mind. As I set up camp and started a fire, I couldn't stop thinking about it. What was it doing there? Who had brought it? And why? As the sun dipped below the horizon and the woods grew darker, I tried to let the tranquility of the night calm me. The crackling of the fire and the distant sound of crickets were soothing, almost enough to make me forget about the strange discovery. Almost. I was sitting in a folding chair, staring up at the stars, when the sound of footsteps shattered the peace. They were faint but unmistakable, crunching through the leaves somewhere behind me. My heart raced as I turned to look. A faint light bobbed between the trees, moving steadily toward the lake. Someone else was out here. I froze, watching the light grow closer, until it suddenly stopped and vanished. Darkness swallowed the woods again. I squinted, trying to spot any movement, but the forest was still. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps again, this time softer, deliberate. They were coming toward me. "Hey, what do you want?" I shouted, my voice echoing into the night. The footsteps stopped abruptly, as if the person had frozen in place. I stood there, tense, waiting for a response. None came. The silence stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, the footsteps began again, retreating this time, fading back into the woods. My mind raced. Whoever it was had been sneaking around, moving quietly, trying not to be noticed, and they were heading in the direction of the trailer. That was it for me. I wasn't going to risk staying the night. I quickly packed up my things, reattached the camper to my truck, and started driving down the narrow path, my headlights cutting through the darkness. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound felt amplified. It was a tense drive, but I finally made it out. The next morning, I called the police and reported what I had seen. 2 officers met me, and I guided them to the spot where the trailer had been. But when we arrived, it was gone. My stomach dropped as I saw the marks on the ground, trails from where the trailer had been dragged all the way to the lake. The tracks ended abruptly at the water's edge. Whatever had been inside the trailer was now at the bottom of the lake, hidden forever. The officers didn't have enough evidence to justify retrieving it, and without anything tangible to go on, the case went nowhere. but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. To this day, I wonder what was inside that trailer and who was out there in the woods that night. The not knowing is the worst part. It's a mystery that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Two years ago, I lived with my younger brother on the East Coast. For the most part, we didn't do much outside of the usual, hanging out with friends, grabbing food, or occasionally going to the movies. But after a while, I started to feel like our routine was getting stale. I wanted to do something different, something that would break us out of the monotony. One day, I came across the idea of camping while browsing online. Living so close to the Appalachian Mountains, it seemed like a no-brainer. I told my brother about it, hoping he'd be interested, but he shrugged it off. Undeterred, I decided to try it on my own. A couple of days later, I went out and bought a small tent, a few basic camping supplies, and some safety tools. I packed an old hiking backpack and picked out a nearby trail from an online list. It wasn't a well-known or popular spot, which I thought would make the experience more peaceful. Yes, I was inexperienced, and going camping alone was a bad idea in hindsight. But I only planned to stay one night, so I figured nothing too serious could happen. After an hour-long drive, I arrived at the trailhead. There were no other cars in the small, dusty parking lot, and the area seemed deserted. I parked, put on my backpack, and started walking toward the trail. The path was narrow and poorly maintained, with overgrown bushes spilling onto it in places. It became clear early on that this wasn't a trail that saw much use. As I hiked further, it became even harder to distinguish the trail from the surrounding wilderness. Grass and weeds had crept in, and in some areas, the path seemed to vanish altogether. Still, I pressed on. After about an hour, I reached the end of the trail and stepped into the designated camping area. The campsite was as overgrown as the trail leading to it, small and unkempt. But what caught my attention immediately was a pile of logs near the far side of the clearing. They were charred, with flakes of burnt wood breaking off in the wind. Someone had been here recently, maybe even the night before. I looked around, but there were no signs of anyone. No tents, no vehicles, no discarded belongings. Uneasy but trying to rationalize it, I walked to the opposite side of the clearing, dropped my things, and started setting up my tent. The sun was still up, so I took my time to make sure everything was secure. Once the tent was up, I rested, eating a quick snack and sitting on my sleeping bag. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I was enjoying the quiet when I heard a faint crackling sound, like the popping of a campfire. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, scanning the clearing. That's when I saw him. A man was sitting across the campsite, right next to the pile of burnt logs. He looked older than me, maybe in his 40s, with a weathered face and an unsettling stillness about him. The last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows that made his figure appear even more ominous. He was already staring at me. Feeling awkward, I raised a hand in a half-hearted wave. He waited a few seconds, then slowly lifted his hand in response. The interaction was brief, but it left me unsettled. I tried to distract myself by gathering some sticks to start my own campfire. As night fell, the campsite became eerily quiet. My small fire crackled softly, casting flickering light across my tent and the surrounding trees. I kept glancing at the man across the way. He hadn't moved. There was no tent near him, no backpack or supplies, just him sitting by the fire. The more I watched, the more uneasy I felt. Where had he come from? My tent was set up right next to the trail. I would have heard him approach. The other side of the campsite was just dense woods. Had he been there all along, waiting? An hour passed, then another. The man didn't move. He just sat there, staring into his fire. Finally, I decided to go into my tent, hoping I was overthinking things. After all, this was a public campsite. He could be just another camper. But sleep didn't come. I lay on my sleeping bag, staring at the tent's ceiling and listening to the faint crackle of his campfire. My mind raced with scenarios, each one more unsettling than the last. Then I heard it, the sound of leaves crunching, slow and deliberate, coming closer. My breath hitched as I sat up, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. A shadow fell across the fabric. It was him. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The man stood there, unmoving, just inches from the thin layer of fabric separating us. I held my breath, waiting for him to say something, to do something, but he didn't. After what felt like an eternity, the shadow began to move away. The sound of crunching leaves faded into the distance until there was only silence. I unzipped the tent and stepped out, my hands trembling. The clearing was empty. His campfire still burned, but the man was gone. Panic set in. I quickly packed up my things, stuffing the tent into its bag without bothering to fold it properly. A couple of rods snapped in my haste, but I didn't care. I needed to get out of there. I left the campsite and hiked back to my car as fast as I could, my flashlight bouncing wildly with each step. The entire way, I felt as though I was being watched. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what his intentions were, but the memory of his shadow outside my tent still sends chills down my spine. This happened just this summer. My best friend Jonah and I, both college students, are the outdoorsy type. We enjoy hiking and camping whenever we get the chance. So, this year, when classes let out for summer, we decided to plan a camping trip. The spot we chose was by a large lake a couple of hours away. While we weren't experts at camping, we weren't clueless either. We knew enough to stay within safe boundaries and planned for only 2 full nights in the wilderness. Excited for the trip, we packed everything we thought we'd need and hit the trail early in the morning. The hike to the lake took a bit longer than expected, but we finally reached it around midday. The lake was vast, with countless trails leading to it from all directions. Its sheer size made it an ideal spot for solitude, and we were relieved to find no one else there. It felt good to know we'd have the place all to ourselves. After resting for an hour to recover from the long hike, we set up our tents in the tree line just beyond the sandy beach. By the time we finished, the sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the water. Jonah got a fire going while I went to gather extra dry sticks to keep it alive through the night. As I wandered a little way into the woods, I suddenly heard a noise ahead. It was faint, but distinct, a rustling, like someone moving through the brush. I froze and squinted into the dimming light. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then I saw it. A figure was walking through the trees, moving steadily but without any sense of direction. The sight of someone else out here, in such an isolated place, immediately set me on edge. I quickly turned back and hurried to the campsite, telling Jonah about what I'd seen. While neither of us felt outright fear, it was undeniably strange. The figure hadn't been walking on any trail or heading toward the beach. They were just wandering aimlessly through the woods. About 15 minutes later, the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the forest into darkness. The fire crackled softly, its light dancing against the surrounding trees. That's when we heard it, footsteps. They were approaching, crunching steadily through the underbrush. A moment later, a man stepped into the glow of our campfire. He looked to be in his 30s, with a scruffy beard and shoulder-length hair. He smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It felt off. "Do you guys know the way to Cedar Trail?" he asked, his tone casual. The name didn't ring any bells. "Sorry, I'm not sure where that is," I replied hesitantly. The man didn't react much. He kept smiling but lingered for a moment, just staring at us. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back into the woods. Jonah and I exchanged uneasy glances. "Was that the same guy you saw earlier?" he asked. "I don't know," I admitted, but deep down I suspected it was. We spent the rest of the evening by the fire, trying to make sense of the encounter. The man didn't seem lost or desperate for help, which would have been understandable. Instead, his demeanor was calm, almost unnervingly so. And why would he walk into the woods alone after dark if he was looking for a trail? As the fire died down, so did our conversation. Eventually, we decided to call it a night. Jonah crawled into his tent while I stayed awake a little longer, listening to the sounds of the forest. Despite the exhaustion, I couldn't shake the unease. About 2 hours later, just as I was beginning to doze off, I heard it again, footsteps. But this time they were close. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to hear. The crunching sound grew louder, and then, through the thin fabric of my tent, I saw a shadow. Someone was standing only 10 feet away. "Jonah!" I shouted, my voice shaking as I scrambled out of my tent. The figure didn't move for a moment, but then it turned and bolted into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. The sound of snapping twigs and crunching leaves faded quickly, leaving the campsite eerily silent. Jonah emerged from his tent, clutching a flashlight. "What happened?" "He was right there," I said, pointing toward the spot. "Standing right there." Jonah's face paled. "We're leaving. Now." Neither of us wasted any time. We packed up hastily, shoving our gear into our backpacks without caring about neatness. The fire had long since gone out, and the woods around us felt oppressive, as if they were closing in. We didn't dare move until dawn. Exhausted and on edge, we sat in the dark, clutching flashlights and waiting for the first rays of sunlight to pierce through the trees. When morning finally came, we started the long hike back, neither of us saying much. The events of the night hung heavily in the air. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but the thought of what might have happened if I hadn't stayed awake still chills me to my core.